I think a lot of people don't understand that the wages and conditions that are around today, that every working person gets, only came because over the years, a lot of men and women battled to get improvements. The way this system of ours seems to work is this. You've got the workers on one side always trying to improve their wages and conditions, and on the other side, the employers, giving them the knockback, looking after what they consider to be their own interests, their profits and their shareholders. Now, that's just the way it is and always was.
I'm the third generation to work on the waterfront. My grandfather was a member in the 1880s. My father was a member of the Federation also up until the 30s. And it was in 1941 that I joined and was on there for 35 years. I enjoyed it immensely. It was a good style of work. There was a variation, and the comradeship amongst the members was extremely good.
I found there that I had men that was good comradeship, help in every way they could. And being unfortunate not hearing so well, I had so much other disappointments before I went on the wharf that sometimes you'd work, but if anybody had to be put off a job, it was the fellow that couldn't hear so much. And all during my years on the wharf, I think there was only once that I was belittled on account of my hearing.
I learned a very important lesson that served me in my years of leadership. We've worked those ships, mostly one gang. We were 24-hour ships, extremely hard work. We'd in fact break world records. And then we'd be that tired after the 24 hours and they walk up the main pathway there to the city, and more than likely we'd get a paper going home to be informed by some leader writer about the laziness of wharf labourers.
Well, there's quite a few characters on the waterfront that had evil intentions against the waterside workers. I'm referring to some foreman stevedores. One particular fellow named Joe, I won't mention his other name, he was never happy unless he was sacking our members. And on one occasion he walked into the shed, that's the shed where they load all the cargo, and looking around what we'd call a kill, trying to catch somebody to sack him. And he came across a little fella sitting down about 5 minutes before smoko with his billiard tee and the paper. He's going to study the race form. And he was enraged, he said, "Whose tea is that?" And the little bloke, little Wharfie said, "It's Lipton's." He said, "He's finished, he's sacked."
During the 1950s, we had many disputes on this waterfront. And what I used to do is write songs about these disputes.
When papers run by Tories carry terrifying stories of the horrid man bosses who oppress me, they may bluster, scream and rage. I just turn another page. For their bedtime stories simply don't impress me, because it's my union. I built this union. If you want to know who runs it, I'm the guy. And no matter what they say, this union's here to stay. 'Cause I'll fight for my union till I die.
Shipping's always been important for Australia. Us being an island and a long way from everywhere, and the sea's international. Ships come from other countries, and the men who work on the wharves come into contact with people from other countries. They hear the news firsthand. At the beginning of the century, work was hard and dirty for waterside workers, and they got paid $1 an hour. That's about 10 cents. The ship owners were doing all right. They were owned by big foreign turnouts, mostly British, who made colossal profits and paid the seamen and wharfies peanuts. 1901 was the year of Australian Federation, when all the Australian colonies got together under one government and one flag. And it was an important time for Australian waterside workers when William Morris Hughes became the first General President of the Federation, and Joe Morris became the first General Secretary. Billy Hughes led the union along the road towards what was probably the most important decision it ever made. In those days, there were 18 different port unions and 6,000 odd members all over Australia. In 1902, a decision was made to bring all these into one Australia-wide union. More unity, more strength. Now, a lot of the work on the waterfront was seasonal, not regular. You couldn't rely on it. Wheat was one of these cargoes. It comes in the summertime and it's hot, heavy work. Accidents and serious injuries were common. There was no workers' compo or sick pay, no dole either. In 1906, the Wharfies who humped wheat went on strike for a better deal. The union put pressure on, and there was a parliamentary inquiry into the size and weight of the bags of wheat. The first witness was S.T. Harrison, secretary of the Sydney branch of the Waterside Workers.
Some of the bags that were loaded onto the ship were weighed on the wharf. I checked them myself. The average weight was 400 pounds a bag. Now that's 400 pounds for one man to lift.
What rate of loading? How many bags and so on?
8 men carried 5,173 bags in 12 hours. Now that's over 100 tons carried by each man. Look, we've had men hurt on the job. They just go on working. Afterwards, they've gone to the hospital and just died there. The employers will put men on and they work them until they drop dead. There's not as much value put on the life of a man as there is on a horse.
Then why do the men take on such hard work?
They need the money to tide them and their families over the lean spells, months when there's no wheat. Most of the men have got wives and children depending on them.
The union kept up the pressure. The outcome was a law saying that the bags had to contain no more than 200 pounds, which is 90 kilograms. And Mr. Daly, he conducted the inquiry. Well, he reckoned it was inhuman for a man to lift and carry more than that. And if you've ever staggered around with 200 pounds on your back, I think you'd agree with him. In 1913, the Federation drew up a log of claims with 60 demands covering the full range of working conditions and rates of pay. 1914. In March, Justice Higgins started to hear the case with General President Billy Hughes, the union's mouthpiece. The employers didn't go for Hughes. For one thing, he was a barrister, and they reckon this gave the union a fighting chance.
Contrary to your objection, Mr. Williams, I'm going to accept Mr. Hughes. He's the president of the Australian Waterside Workers Federation and the logical representative of his union's interests.
1915, December the 5th.
The court is in session.
This was a milestone. The award was handed down by the court, and it was the Wharfies' first Commonwealth Award that covered the whole range. We got a 44-hour week, double rates for public holidays, continuous work limited to 12 hours instead of 24, and a few more things besides.
Therefore, the court fixes as the proper basic wage 8 shillings and 6pence a day, or 1 shilling and 9pence an hour, which is the basic wage to a labourer of average strength and competence. If a man keeps a horse, he must feed that horse on the days that he does not use him as well as on the days that he does. And if a man keeps 2 or more horses and uses them in rotation, he must feed them all the time.
The courts of the land recognised that we should at least have equal rights with working horses. Well, that put us a little bit in front. In the First World War, Billy Hughes was now Prime Minister and suddenly in favour of compulsory conscription. But a lot of people, especially Labor people, were dead set against the idea of people being forced to fight and die in a foreign land in someone else's lousy war. Well, conscription was put to a referendum. People could vote yes or no, and Hughes asked for a yes vote. Well, the people said no, and threw out conscription, and the Labor Party threw out Hughes. 1917, a major strike. The tramway workers' employers tried to bring in a new system which would have laid the tramway men open to speed-up tactics and broken down conditions they'd fought hard for. Other workers, including the Wharfies, struck to support the tramway men, and soon there were 100,000 unionists on strike. Trade had been falling off because of the war. Jobs were scarce and the economy was depressed. In our system, it always seems to be either boom or bust, nothing in between. In boom time, when there's plenty of jobs around, the workers have a show of improving their conditions. But But in 1917, the boot was on the other foot. The bosses were putting it in. Sometimes it takes years just to win even the smallest improvements to working conditions. To have them taken away at the boss's say-so isn't easy to accept. The newspapers, as usual, were anti the workers. They reckon the whole thing was led by revolutionaries. They blamed the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies. 12 so-called Wobblies were arrested and sent to jail. But later they had to be let out again when it was proved they'd been put in by mistake after being framed by the police. Well, as they say, what's new? As usual, there were talks and arguments and promises and compromises, and the thing was finally settled and it was back to work again. 1918 saw the end of the First World War. The Australian soldiers who were lucky enough to come home were welcomed by Billy Hughes. The ship owners pressed ahead with their plans to give the work to non-union labour. They set up their own labour bureau, and they only recruited men for work on the wharves who they knew wouldn't be too militant. Men like non-unionists and returned soldiers, only too glad of any peacetime job.
Bloody scab.
Careful, mate, I'm not scared. Oh. Hey. Get off him, mate! Let him go! Get off him, mate! Get off him, mate! Take it easy, fella. Come on.
The ship owners got away with their non-union labour bureau for 7 years. 1919, Ross and Keith Smith flew all the way here from England in their little aeroplane. Those days, of course, nobody'd ever seen an aeroplane, let alone been in one. After that, in a way, we didn't seem to be so cut off from the rest of the world, and it meant ships weren't the only method of transport between countries.
One day the boys were unloading cement off the Brett's Wharf, and Ming the Merciless was in charge as a supervisor. The 6 hand truckers found the going pretty hard, and Ming the Merciless called on our delegate, Mickey Blunt, to ask him why the boys wasn't doing their work properly. And Mickey said, well, it's a very hot day and they can't get up that bit of a hill as quick as we'd like to be. And Ming the Merciless said to Mickey Blunt, well, you tell the boys I'll give them 3p an hour extra if they'll put an extra bag of cement on their hand trucks. Mickey said, I'll do that, Ming. So anyway, Mickey done that. And about several minutes later, Ming the Merciless said to Mickey again, did you tell the boys what I tell you? And he said, yes, I did. He said, and the boys told me to tell you that if you would let them take 1 bag of cement off their hand trucks, they'll all give you 3p an hour extra.
What a beauty. Old Wharfies always tell you that one of the worst things about the waterfront in those days was there was no such thing as a fair share of the work. The bulls, as they were called, were always the first ones picked up for the job. They were called bulls because they were the big, strong ones who'd work under any conditions, be they dangerous, dirty, or hard. Once the boss had picked his bulls up, the rest of them could fight for the jobs that were left.
The pickup was where men appeared at the wharf gates, formed a circle, and they waited for the foreman to come out and pick them up for a job for the ship that berthed at that wharf. And the Hungry Mile was the area from Walsh Bay along Darling Harbour to the Pyrmont Bridge, where hungry men with hungry families appeared before these foremen for a job, a day's work.
He would have beer bought for him by the men working below, the holders in the gang, and whoever bought the most beer would be assured of getting a job on the next occasion. One particular hatchman, known as 10%, on an occasion when he needed new boots, would put his foot over the coaming and sing out to the men working below, I want a new pair of boots, it's new boots or new holies on the next job.
The boys up in Queensland fought hard against this bull system. They were very militant up there and they had good reason to be. That was where they carried sugar all day in the blistering sun.
I joined the Federation in 1935. I've seen the pickup, been in the pickup, where the employer, after picking up his regulars, would then look over the remaining people and actually swivel his eyes around. And I've seen men run from side to side in order to catch the eye of the boss. This is humiliation in the extreme.
This method of selection of labour led to degradation, the loss of dignity by the members, a situation where only those were subservient and servile got all the work to the detriment of the others, and the union was absolutely impotent to do anything about it.
In 1928, the Federation had been worried about the number of bad accidents on the job. They were also claiming a wage increase. They had a good case to back up their claim too. Judge Beebe was just about to bring out a new award for the waterside workers.
George. Good to see you.
And before he did, he travelled around looking at working conditions in the ports and talking to the ship owners and to the union blokes on the job. The Melbourne Wharfies reckon he must have spent more time travelling than anything else, because they say he only spent 5 hours inspecting conditions in Port Melbourne.
Here he is now. Only half an hour late. Got with his car, perhaps.
Right, men, let's get going. Where do we start?
George Phillips, Treasurer.
Beebe.
Ted Wainwright.
How are you?
Branch President. Bill Maher, Secretary.
Pleased to meet you. All right. Let's go, shall we? I haven't got a lot of time. Shouldn't be too long.
Beebe announced the new award in July 1928, and it was worse than anyone expected.
The court is now in session.
Reduced overtime rates, still 2 pickups a day,
Gentlemen,
and heavy penalties for strike action.
We are living in very, very...
Safety was one of the things the Federation was most worried about. Beebe was going to look into that. Other claims were also going to be considered. But the most important claim of all, the wage increase, got thrown out completely.
Make sacrifices for the betterment of all Australian people.
On the day before the strike itself occurred in Port Adelaide, each man, as he came down the gangplank, was asked whether or not he was prepared to work under the new award handed down by Mr. Justice Beebe. Each man had refused.
There was a vote to reject the award and call a general strike. And what do you think the ship owners did again? They brought in the scabs, thousands of them, and it was on for young and old. There was another serious problem too. The decision to strike hadn't been unanimous. There was a serious lack of unity. The strike was a disaster and a tragedy. Melbourne was probably the worst.
The Beebe Award ushered in the worst conditions ever witnessed on the Australian waterfront, and I would say of any trade union in the world at that particular time. The conditions were appalling indeed. Families were starved, and the waterside workers especially that went through that period know what the problems were when their union was divided and confused. The Conservative Bruce Page government and waterfront employers set up the permanent and casual union of workers, scabs on the waterfront, to work under the conditions and to accept the Beebe Award, which other workers had refused to accept.
There's still a few old-timers around who remember the 28 strike.
The Lord above bring down the doves with wings as sharp as razors to cut the throats of bloody scabs who cut down poor men's wages.
The scabs were coming down on barges, and we decided that we'd try to stop them from getting off the barges. So we went onto the pier. We were chased off the pier with police with batons. One policeman chased me with his baton, but he couldn't catch me. I was very fast in those days. Those who wasn't so fast had to jump into the water to get out that way. Well, we decided we'd take some action, so we got some sticks, and the police started firing revolvers. So we ran behind a little cafe there, the end of the pier, and he was firing guns at us. We'd put our head out and throw a stone at him, and he fired a revolver. One of the guns, bullet hit a stone and ricocheted past it, so we decided they weren't blank, so we just retired gracefully. Well, a chap named Whittaker, as we were raiding the pier, was shot, and he died. It was a terrible tragedy, and we missed him. We all missed him very much, and we did something about it in remembrance. We stood still for remembrance.
Well, I was out of work for 9 years, and the conditions that we had to live under were deplorable. I was invited to an old lady's place in Gladstone Street, and what we had for Christmas dinner, the two of us, there was only two of us went round, we had boiled apples, 2 slices of bread and jam with it, and a cup of tea, and that was our Christmas dinner. That was the conditions, and those type of conditions practically broke our family up.
They suffered badly psychologically because of that factor. Their children, the malnutrition that they had suffered during those depression years was evident in their faces as late as the 40s, if not for all of their life.
Well, if it's not one thing, it's another. In the 1930s, the Great Depression arrived. Boom and bust. Bust and boom. The Wharfies, same as workers everywhere, got badly knocked about.
When I was working, we had to have a hook to go to a wool job to turn the bales over. But the funny thing about the hook, you could take it to the pawnbroker and you could pawn it for 2 bob. And the pawnbroker personally said to me, which I knew personally, he said to me, he said, listen, Ben, he said, I've got enough hooks here, I don't use them. He said, I'll give the caper away. He said, I can't put up with this. He said, I've got a window full of them.
Unemployment, poverty, the humiliation of charity, the down and outs living in shacks made of rusty iron and old boxes. Some blokes got knocked about so badly they could never get going again. But out of the bad times, good things often happen. I don't think there's anyone on the waterfront who hasn't heard of Big Jim Healy, General Secretary of the Federation for 24 years.
My father, Jim Healy, was born in Manchester, England in 1898. His father, old Dominic Healy, was pretty active in the labour movement over there at the time. And I suppose that's where Dad got his early training for the labour movement. And he joined the Royal Argyle Sutherland Highlanders. He went to war. He was invalided in 1917. A bomb blew up in front of him and, pretty badly wounded him in both his legs. He was discharged from the army in 1918 in Scotland, where he met my mother, Betty McGowan, his future wife. They were married in 1919. They settled in Manchester, England, where I was born, along with my brother John. But job opportunities were few and far between. So Dad decided to take advantage of a migration plan that was going ahead at the time to fetch us all out here to Australia. And he always said it was one of the best tenors he ever spent.
When Healy took over the helm in 1937, a whole new lease of life opened up for the Federation. He brought unity and stability, and we went from strength to strength.
When Healy was elected, it was a tremendous victory for us. The Federation was in a dreadful state. There was the waterfront, all the labour force was disunited, different unions, some of it unorganised, completely unorganised, and the state of the union, it was very disunited inside the Federation itself. And the victory of Healy was the right thing.
The big problem standing in the way of a completely unified waterfront was that in some ports there were still 2 unions. One, which was the real union, the Federation, and the so-called union, the scab one, the permanent and casuals, which came into being after the 1928 general strike. Now, it took someone like Jim Healy to work out how to cope with this.
It's a terrible badge to wear, the badge of a scab. It lives with you, it goes to the grave with you. But progressives on the waterfront realised if we were to do something about the appalling conditions,
we would need every ounce of unity that we could gain. This meant that we would have to absorb the permanent and casual organisation, bring it under our wing, control them, because the difference between them was only on emphasis, and us was only in emphasis. We would be striving for the same things, fighting the same boss, but where we were divided, the boss and the government of the day were having a real picnic.
It took us years of education of the members to convince them for the absorption of the scabs. My same thoughts for the scabs, even after all these years, I still hate the bastards. But us militants could see that if we were going to get anywhere here, there had to be unity on the waterfront.
Towards the end of the Depression, things started to pick up a bit, but there still wasn't enough work to go round. Men still walked for miles and sometimes camped out all night waiting for the chance of a job. Men who did get jobs worked in primitive conditions, handling dangerous and dirty cargoes without proper clothing, working in freezing conditions, long hours, and there was no sick pay, no public holidays, and no annual leave. Nothing. These sorts of conditions still hung around for the next 20 years.
The very first job I had on the waterfront was carrying soda ash, which is really caustic soda. It's very heavy, around about 150 to 180 pounds, and very loose, so that when it was dumped on your shoulder, you got a cloud of chemical all over your face. It took the skin off your shoulders, you sneezed, your eyes ran, and by the end of the day, you were almost a physical wreck.
Talking of obnoxious cargoes, I'd like to relate to asbestos, where we used to unload it by bags. There used to be thousands of tonnes used to come here from overseas, and it was necessary, of course, to use a hook to handle the bag, with the result that there was always spillage. The bags would be torn a little bit, and we'd be kicking it out of our road with our feet, etc. But no one knew at that time, or we didn't know in any way, the dangers that was associated with asbestos.
I can recall even in summertime, in the late 1940s, in Brisbane, we asked for cold water, some ice water, instead of the hot water we used to get down below, especially about 100 degrees. We were ridiculed, we were refused it. We decided that we'd take action to get it. And even the media took up the call from the employers and ridiculed it. What will they want next, was the cry from the editor of the Courier Mail. What will they want next? Pink ice cream.
Well, there was one very sad aspect of the wharf, that there was no long service leave, no holidays, and some of the old fellas, even fellas I know by name, and I've seen them all really without fear of contradiction, I've seen them 75 going 80. And they just had to keep working because they had nothing to retire for, and they had nothing to live on. And during the years, they had no hope of accumulating any money because he never ever earned that much.
In 1945, the government medical officer, Dr. McQueen, investigated the health of the Wharfies. This is what he found. Blood pressure. Blood pressure, when normal, is equivalent to 140 millimeters. A large proportion of the men in the industry were over 200 millimeters. In any other industry, these men would be candidates for the industrial scrap heap. I can say without hesitation that there is no other industry that can produce the number of physical derelicts that I have encountered on the waterfront. This is the price of profit.
But little by little, the union made some gains. By the end of the 30s, we'd won meal money of 2 bob or 20 cents. Now, it mightn't sound much now, but you've got to remember that those were lean and hungry days.
Charlie Schindler always had a sugar bag. He opens the sugar bag and he takes out a loaf of bread and a knife and he looks along the wall. He said, we're all looking at him, of course, see what he's got in the bag. We're interested because we're hungry and we got no lunch. So he said to us, haven't you bastards got any lunch? We said, no lunch, Charlie. Cut it into 4 pieces, and that's what he done. So that's what we had for lunch.
It often happened on the waterfront, instances like that. It showed the comradeship that existed amongst waterside workers. If one was in trouble and the other had something, in them days they'd help one another out.
Now, the union's campaigns didn't stop at bread and butter issues, wages and conditions and so on. They were also concerned about what was happening overseas. In the 1930s, a lot of people were very worried about what this maniac was up to. Japan was a worry too. What worried people most was that they'd started invading other countries, China for example, with a possible threat of another war. Jim Healy was still limping from a serious leg injury he suffered in the 1914 war, and he personally had strong anti-war views. When the Conservative government promised to send some of our pig iron to Japan, the Wharfies decided that it was time to take some action because they reckoned the Japanese would send the pig iron back as bullets. The South Coast branch refused to load a ship called the Dalfram with pig iron for Japan. They walked off. Rupert Lockwood wrote a book about this.
Because I thought the arrival of the tramp steamer Dalfram in Port Kembla Harbour in November 1938 caused Australian society to be confronted with one of the most ancient of conflicts, the right of men to refuse policies they considered to be evil, the right to place conscience above bad policy or bad law. Normally when workers go on strike, they're expecting extra money or some other benefit. In the Port Kembla case, there was no suggestion of any gain. They did it entirely for principle.
They stuck to their principles against the full force of the Conservative government. None of Menzies' flowery speeches about the essence of democracy, none of his threats of jailing would budge the Port Kembla Wharfies, who still refused to load the pig iron. They lived from fish they caught in the bay, rabbits they trapped in the bush, and of course the donations of other unionists, including the BHP steelworkers.
I described them in this book as the conscience of the nation, because as the former Governor-General, Sir Isaac Isaacs, admitted, they had expressed for the whole Australian people their conscience and their humanitarian feelings.
In the Domain, I publicly called Menzies Pig Iron Bob, and that name stuck to him right throughout his life. And somebody asked Menzies, where did you get that nickname from? And he said, from that bastard Moran.
The Port Kembla Wharfies stuck it out until a deal was made, an agreement reached. Everyone agreed that once the present contract ran out, there'd be no more pig iron for Japan. What happened later on, the Second World War, proved that the Wharfies were right to ban the pig iron.
The bombing of Darwin, the first attack on Australian soil.
The Japanese raids on Darwin in 1942 took place when the wharves were full of ships.
First light that fateful morning.
The wharves took the brunt of it, and 243 lives were lost, including seamen and wharfies.
243 lives and 10 aircraft had been lost. The war was on our northern doorstep.
1941, a Labor government under Prime Minister Curtin took over from Menzies.
The full cabinet today directed the War Cabinet to gazette the necessary regulations for the complete mobilisation and the complete ordering of all the resources, human and material, in this Commonwealth for the defence of this Commonwealth.
He went to the Waterside Workers Federation and other unions, and he said, we can win this. It's a people's war. To get it over, we want a full effort from the trade union movement. Jim Healy told Curtin, fair enough. But we put up with a lot in the past, and we want a fair go too. Now, all the work was to be controlled by the Stevedoring Industry Commission, and the Federation would have its own representative there. There'd be a roster system and a registration system. We got 2 weeks annual leave based on a 44-hour week and attendance money. It was the beginning of the gang rotary system.
Regarding the gang system, that was probably one of the greatest things that ever happened within the branch of Port Adelaide. possibly the Federation. It done away with the vicious bull system, the competition between members.
This was eminently fair and resulted in workers obtaining selection for work as their turn came round, and it spread from the larger ports to the smaller ports, who all introduced various forms of equalisation schemes to give every member a fair go.
Prior to the advent of the gang rotary system, the Commission, the Stevedoring Industry Commission, was in charge of the discipline of our members. We resented this fact because we realised that the men had more respect for union discipline than they had from an outside body.
In 1947, the Wharfies took another stand for peace. This was in support of the Indonesian people who were demanding independence. They wanted to break away from Dutch colonial rule. The Wharfies supported the Indonesians and refused to load Dutch ships. The union had said, the Indonesians are afraid the Dutch will start a war against Indonesia. Haven't we had enough of war?
We will never forget the great help Australian labour has given us in the vital first days of our republic when we need that help most. And may Australia and Indonesia be united forever! Indonesia Merdeka! Indonesia Merdeka!
The boycott against the Dutch lasted 4 years. 31 other Australian trade unions joined the Wharfies boycott, and bans were put on loading Dutch ships in 14 other countries.
The Republic of Indonesia has been proclaimed.
The Dutch were finally driven out of Indonesia. The Indonesians got their independence, and the trade union movement worldwide played a big part in helping them get it.
These are the salient points in the Republic Democratic Constitution.
In 1954, lo and behold, Pig Iron Bob Menzies was back in the saddle and on the warpath again. He passed a law through Parliament that would have taken away the union's say in how the waterfront labour was recruited. He wanted to give it back to the ship owners again. This film, made by the Wharfies' own film unit in the 50s, tells the story of how the members reacted.
Every seaport in Australia stopped work in protest against the bill. But at the union centres in every port was beginning one of the most determined campaigns in the history of the trade unions. Wharfies came in their thousands, ready to lend a hand. Committees were needed, finance, publicity and welfare committees. For every man needed, 100 volunteered. Wharfies' wives, always playing their part on the home front, battling to make ends meet, responded magnificently. They formed committees and worked alongside their men.
The outcome was that the union established its right to recruit the labour as before. At this time, Australia was well on its way to becoming a multicultural society. Some 15% of Australia's 10 million people were born overseas, and that percentage was reflected in the Federation's membership. In the middle 50s, mechanisation came in, bulk loading. Hundreds of jobs were lost when cargoes like sugar and grain, which used to be carried on men's backs, began to move by belt. With the introduction of this new equipment and the super profits it brought the employers, the union, keen to improve the members' lot when they were at work, also wanted to give them some kind of decent, secure pension to retire with. A delegation went to Canberra to put a case for industry pensions. General Secretary Jim Healy was honest and fair, and he got things done. But there were also people who saw a man like Jim Healy, with his talent for leadership, as a threat. What happened down in Hobart in 1956 bore this out. Frank Hersey and his son, and another Hobart Wharfie, kicked off by refusing to pay a union levy for the Labor Party, and then refused to pay their union dues. The Hobart Wharfies saw them for what they were, industrial renegades, and refused to work with them. The union saw the position clearly. They said, if the government forces us to work with non-union labour, it'll put us back 50 years at one hit.
Well, the thing developed quickly. There were black bans, strikes, picket lines, and hundreds of days of suspension from work were suffered by the Hobart Wharfies. Now, as it went on, it became obvious that the Herseys were being used by the breakaway anti-Labor Party made up of the DLP and the industrial groupers.
The groupers held a meeting to elect a challenger to Jim Healy in the coming union election.
I'd be confident to stand against him now. Anyway, there's 3 months before the election. Anything could happen to Healy in that time. He could pass away. He's a sick man, you know.
May God help him on that path, gentlemen.
Well, the Federation leadership flashed past the post with 12,000 votes more than the groupers. And in 1959, the High Court upheld the union's right to impose a levy and make it a condition of membership. The Herseys left the waterfront, and you can be sure the Hobart Wharfies gave them the sailors' farewell.
In 1961, Jim Healy died. He'd been General Secretary for 24 years. Thousands went to his funeral. Not only waterside workers, but people from all walks of life who admired all he'd achieved.
The death of Jim Healy was a terrible blow to the Federation. Jim Healy had a sense of tolerance and a sense of unity, which was of great advantage to the Federation. The unity was shown within our Federation over the years by our struggles. He was able to state his policy so clearly to the members, which brought about a respect that was unknown in our Federation previously.
There was people that said that, well, he was a militant man. Of course he was a militant man. He had to be militant. He was up against such a lot of ruthless people. And if we didn't go for something, you would never get it.
And his great asset was his great ability to instill into the workers a faith in themselves, a faith in their ability to go forward and win the aims that they'd set out for themselves. And they mourned him for a very, very long time.
When news come through to this port of Jim Healy's death, without any direction from the executive at all, the ships automatically stopped. Not only at Wharfies, but seamen as well. I seen men coming off the ship crying because he was one of the greatest trade unions leaders, or the greatest trade union leader this country has ever seen.
After Jim Healy, Charlie Fitzgibbon became Federal Secretary and held that position for a long time, 22 years.
We have our arguments with the employers, obviously, but having reached an agreement, we keep that agreement for the term of its...
The union continued to improve things for its members, including a credit union for all waterfront workers and permanent employment, not casual as it had been. The long battle for industry pensions was finally won, and we got the 35-hour week in 1972. Norm Docker had been appointed industrial officer in 1951. Docker had been the main advocate for the Federation, appearing in hundreds of industrial, arbitration commission and federal court hearings. He was good too. Even the judges gave him a wrap-up.
When I first started on the waterfront in 1950, the method of loading and discharging vessels was very much as it had been in the days of the Phoenicians, thousands of years before. The difference was that we were using steam winches and the Phoenicians had to use manpower. In the 50s, the late 50s and the 60s, enormous changes occurred on the Australian waterfront and indeed on most waterfronts throughout the world. These changes were characterised by what was called the cellular container vessel. The essential difference between these classes of vessels and the earlier conventional ones was that in the earlier conventional ones, in the main, cargo was carried in very small parcels and the men individually would lift and carry those parcels. In that system, I have known a ship to work for 3 weeks in this port of Sydney with 300 men working on that ship right around the clock in 3 different shifts. With the other system, the loads were so large and could be handled so quickly and efficiently that the same amount of cargo could be loaded and discharged from a cellular container vessel in perhaps less than 1 day, employing no more than a dozen men.
Norm Docker followed Charlie Fitzgibbon as General Secretary in 1983. He was an officer with the Federation for 33 years in all.
It started off as a most primitive industry with absolutely no amenities and no security for the men by either while at work, while in the industry, or after they had left it. Most men who left it because they had become broken physically. As a prerequisite for all these changes, a strong democratic union had to be built. And that union has been responsible in the main for the development of a modern, highly skilled and responsible labour force with an industry functioning efficiently in the interests of the Australian nation.
The union's a member of the International Transport Workers Federation, which covers 400 unions all around the world. Now, some seamen from third world countries don't even have unions and work under the most appalling conditions. Some don't even get paid at all. Now, through its membership of the ITF, the Federation's able to bring pressure on ship owners and get these crews justice. However, under the current Trade Practices Act, there are still provisions which can work unfairly and restrict the union in its pursuit of a fair go for its members and a fair go for exploited seamen from third world countries.
Our General Secretary, Taz Bull.
The present General Secretary is Taz Bull. He joined the Federation in Hobart in 1956 and he's been General Secretary since 1984.
First thing that I would like the conference to endorse is the presence of the media for the period of the Minister's speech.
This is the All Ports Conference, where all the branches around Australia come together to discuss important issues and make decisions.
At this conference, in addition to the Minister for Transport addressing us, that we would have delegates from Denmark, Fiji, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Japan, the United States, the USSR, and a representative of the African National Council. We also indicated that the items on the agenda would be the working conditions of waterside workers, national issues, US bases in Australia, other international questions such as trade with South Africa, East Timor, relations with Indonesia.
Today we negotiate working conditions on a 2-yearly contract basis. The Federation's negotiating team meets with employers 3 or 4 times over a period of several months. At the conclusion of those negotiations, reports are made to our membership throughout the country, and then the members decide by secret ballot whether the agreement reached can be endorsed or not. Issues that arise on a day-to-day basis are normally resolved by meetings of the federal or port negotiating committees. These committees consist of equal numbers of employer and union representatives and deal with all of those issues which are not capable of being covered in the 2-yearly contract. Normally we're able to find a consensus and resolve the problem, but occasionally the issue develops into a dispute. But I think it has to be said that a great deal of progress has been made in finding solutions which don't lead to disputes.
The job's very different now. Most of the heavy work is a thing of the past. Machines do the hard work, and today's wharfies are trained to operate them. There's been a reduction in membership from 20,000 to 7,500. However, new members, tradesmen and shipping clerks, joined the Federation in 1978 and offset the losses to some extent.
Keith, you mentioned before
the Federation several years ago adopted a policy in favour of a maritime federation. That would mean linking together the seamen, officers, engineers, foremen, supervisors and waterside workers into one organisation. Such an organisation would probably number about 20,000. We think it's a necessary step. The employers are organised both nationally and internationally into such associations, and as it happens, the policy adopted by our union has subsequently been endorsed by the whole Australian trade union movement, and what we see in this country today is the development of bigger industry-wide unions, and that's the course that we're on.
Stand by, mate. Yeah, righto, mate. Could you place that box into B4, pads 9 and 10, thank you.
Things have changed a lot over the years, thanks to all the people who fought for change. People who stuck together and stuck to the union.
The Waterside Workers, with a proud and militant tradition of struggle, swing down the streets of Sydney.
The Wharfies union keeps on working for a fair deal for its members and for peace and friendship in the world.
They can call me agitator, they can even call me traitor, they can tell me that my brain is off the track, but I'm smart enough to see what this union's done for me. So I'm rolling up my sleeves and fighting back, because it's my union. I built this union. If you want to know who runs it, I'm the guy. And no matter what they say, this union's here to stay. 'Cause I'll fight for my union till I die.